Well, Keith Cowing is a former employee of the U.S. space agency NASA. He's now editor of NASAWatch.com. He joins us here for more insight on this. Keith, how much of a setback is this for India?
Well, in terms of the lander, they're not giving up. It may have crashed. It may have come in kind of hard and is pointing their antenna in the wrong direction. But they still have an orbiter, Chandrayaan-2, in orbit now, and it's in perfect condition. So it's a disappointment in some aspects of this. But the bulk of the science for this mission is being done by the orbiter, and that orbiter, again, is doing just fine. So a little disappointment, but you know, they'll make up for it.
What specific challenges did this Indian spacecraft face as it attempted to land? I understand the problems started about 2 kilometers above the surface.
If you watch the animation, which is probably everybody's seen by now, you see a little line that shows how it's coming. It looks just fine, and then about 2.1 kilometers up, it made a jiggle and stopped. And some speculation is that the spacecraft started to point in the wrong direction. It sped up, maybe it crashed, maybe it landed very hard. So everything was perfect until that last little bit. So, you know, as they say, space is hard, but India came really, really close to getting it perfectly right.
Space is hard, but they're not starting from scratch as the Americans and the Soviets did. Is there any knowledge that could have prevented this? Is there something that we know that happens at that 2-kilometer mark?
Practice makes perfect, but the interesting thing about India is that they're able to mount these missions at a fraction of what it costs us. So I think they've learned the right lessons here in that if you are frugal about how you do things, if you have a failure, just try again.
As our reporter Shweta Bajaj mentioned, there are other countries have been trying to get to the moon. It is an exclusive club. The Indians and Israelis tried this year, probably won't give up. Is anyone else trying?
Well, interestingly, back in the day when I was growing up, there was the U.S. and the Soviet Union. We had a big race, and there was only 2 countries that could do this. Now, everybody seems to be wanting to go back to the moon, but it's not just countries. There are several large corporations, Elon Musk's SpaceX and Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin, that have enough funds pretty much to do a nation-sized space program, and they're going to go back to the moon because they can. And so this time it's a different cast of characters, which will be interesting. I think it'll spice up the competition a bit.
So it's been 50 years since the first steps on the moon. Given what you've just said, is this focus on the moon half a century later where money needs to be spent right now?
The old adage is where you stand depends on where you sit. For the U.S., many people say, well, we've already done that, or we did that 50 years ago. And yet, why is it that these other countries are excited about this? And we're sort of blasé. What are they discovering that's important, worthy of spending resources that many would argue could be spent elsewhere? And the answer is it's not just the prestige of doing something, but it's the technological infrastructure that one builds and brings to bear on this that has benefits well beyond just landing something on the moon. So is it worth spending money on this? I think the answer is yes, because so many countries are doing so.
Is the money being diverted from other places that you think would help in terms of space exploration that are not happening because we know the U.S. wants to go back to the moon? Donald Trump, for example, wants a space force. Could that money be targeted towards something else perhaps in space that could get us further along?
You know, I think pretty much you can argue about the whole Space Force thing since we've been doing that anyways for years. They just want a new name and fancy uniforms. But in terms of where the money's being spent, I think it's being spent pretty much in the right place. At this point. Unfortunately, every time we have an election, everything gets thrown up in the air and we start over again. That's a problem. We're not consistent. We don't stick with these things, whereas India and China are sticking with a plan, and it's working for them.
And speaking of China, they landed their spacecraft on the far side of the moon this year, first for China. Talk a little bit about its place in the race for space and how that relates to the rest of the world.
Well, if you look at China's plan, it's very methodical. You could just see exactly what they're trying to do. They learn to do one thing, then they learn to do another thing, then they combine those things together to do another thing. Now they've landed on the far side of the moon with a relay satellite, and the next thing they're going to do soon is actually send a follow-on mission to land and bring a sample of the moon back to Earth. And if you look at the things that they land on the moon and sort of squint a little bit, and imagine them about twice as big, they look like the descent stage for something of a vehicle that would carry humans. So there's a methodical approach that China's taken. And everybody has noticed that China has plans for the moon, and they're, again, just being very methodical on this, and they take their time, and they get things right.
Keith Cowing from NASAWatch.com, thank you for joining us.